Hey, Delco Alliance Church,
Howdy.
and anyone else who just might happen to stumble upon these, maybe in the year like 2030, 2040, as you're doing a research project, wondering what did happen in 2020. What you'll know for sure is that we are doing a series on Ecclesiastes in our church.
That's right.
And that's probably the best, it's probably the only information you need to understand what's happening in 2020. As far as I can tell, it's the most important thing going on right now.
The
Right?
most important, yes.
Yes. Want to apologize ahead of time. There are people working on the face of my building, and so there might be times where you hear loud thumps or drilling, and I will just, I might jump off screen to yell at those workers. I won't actually do that. We'll just sit and bear it because I'm weak and I'm afraid of conflict. So we are in week 3 of our Ecclesiastes series, and this week we are talking about wealth and possessions. It is a theme that is prevalent not only throughout all of Scripture, but especially in Ecclesiastes, as we're considering the main themes of how time, death, and chance happen to all of us. What does anything mean anything? And what role does wealth and possessions have to play in our lives? So every week we've been starting off by just re-engaging this term in the Old Testament in Ecclesiastes called Hevel. And Stephen, you're really good at explaining what is Hevel. How do we understand what Hevel is in Ecclesiastes?
Well, I'll say that the Bible Project's really good at explaining this. I'm definitely indebted to them. So when you're reading the book of Ecclesiastes, it would be impressive if you missed the word meaningless or vanity. Like, that word is everywhere in the book. And that's the word that Jordan's talking about. The Hebrew word hevel is translated into vanity or meaninglessness in our Bibles. The Bible Project, actually, they encourage us to also think of this word as like a smoke or a vapor. And this word can be translated as vapor. So it's like a metaphor for us. So I have a candle here. I was going to light it and blow it out, but you can't see the smoke when I blow it out. But imagine I lit it, I blow it out, and you'd see kind of the smoke rise, and then it'd fade away. And so in a similar way, the author of Ecclesiastes is saying that these things like money, like work, like relationships, we can be tempted to find our meaning in them. But if we do that, it'll be temporary. It'll be fleeting like the smoke. The smoke that was once there that maybe you thought you could grab onto because it was visible, your hands move through it. You can't grasp it. It's fleeting. It'll eventually go away. So the author is basically saying all these things that we can be tempted to find meaning in are temporary and fleeting, and they will leave us disappointed in the end. If the author's teaching isn't disappointing enough for you, you'll eventually experience the disappointment.
Yeah, which we've talked about, like, to be clear, like this conversation about meaninglessness. It doesn't mean either that these things don't exist, and it doesn't mean that those things are necessarily bad.
Yeah.
Right? Like, work is a real thing and we do it every day. Possessions and wealth are a real thing and we deal with them every day. And they each even have a place, but in the same way that smoke serves a function to display the location of where there's a fire, right? Like, this smoke actually is helping us point to something meaningful that is eternal, like that is lasting. Like, it is a signal when we get too caught up into it, that there is something real and substantial that it is pointing to that matters. And we need to find out what the core of that is to actually enjoy or understand what the smoke is for. You need to understand what's at the core of yourself to understand the place that work takes in your life, right? I think the smoke is a really helpful metaphor. So in the book of Ecclesiastes, we've got this guy named the teacher who, from our perspective, is walking around his kingdom and just pointing to things and making observations. And there's a guy who's like writing this down or recording it, or maybe even reflecting on it, giving pushback to it at certain points. But and so in the same way, like, we can do this every day and look at our mission field in terms of this. And so, like, in terms of wealth, Like I was walking around Delaware the other day, as I do because I live on Sandusky Street. I was walking my dog, and we were in Coffeeology, and I went downstairs. If you've been in Coffeeology, the bathroom is downstairs. It used to be an antique store, so you go downstairs, and if you actually look left, there's a whole nother room downstairs filled with antiques, right? There's not necessarily price on them. There's not necessarily like uh, a way to look at even them all. And I realized like Delaware has a couple antique stores that we've been into. And I just thought about antique stores in general. They're so interesting. Antique stores are places where people's most treasured possessions, or who were once their most treasured possessions, now sit and gather dust and are just looked at, right? They're I'm not saying antique stores are bad, but there is a reality in which you walk through them and look at all the things that someone once owned and have now probably passed away, and it's made its way here. You're never going to buy those things. No one's ever probably going to treasure them again. And now they sit and gather dust. Some of them are super expensive. Some of them are super ornate. And now they are something that I look at as I walk on my way to the restroom. And I realize that in many ways, possessions and wealth end up being hevel. They end up being meaningless. Like most of the things I own or the things that I'm moving forward to owning will not be prized by someone else and will eventually fade away in the future, right? That's just the nature of wealth and possessions. And that's just how we relate to them. We try to find value in them. But Stephen, from your perspective, as human beings, why are we tempted to find value in wealth and possessions, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I think kind of two things come to mind. I think of how often our culture is, and honestly, even me, I'm impressed with like a really nice house or someone's new car or someone's XYZ. They have like an awesome piece of furniture that I'm sitting on and just like, man, this is like one of the best pieces of furniture I've sat on. And the reality is all those things cost money. And I think we ascribe status to people who can afford these things. So not only is there a luxury in experiencing them, but there's also a status in having them. And I think that's one reason we're tempted to have money in that way. Yeah. So there's definitely like the status and the luxury piece. I also think there's a control piece. Money, you can do a lot of things with money. You can do a lot of your prayers that you lift up to God. There's a handful of them that we can at least be tempted to believe that money could solve it. Like think you have a health issue. If you had enough money, you could see the best doctors in the world. Yep. You're praying that you can find a way to go to college. Money would make college not an issue for you. So I think there's a lot of ways where money, if we had enough, we believe that our prayers would be answered, that we would no longer be anxious, that we'd no longer be X, Y, Z. I think we think money can't answer our prayers, honestly.
Totally. When you were talking about status in furniture, I was reminded of a show that was big when we were teenagers called Cribs.
Yeah.
Remember the show Cribs?
Or Pimp My Ride.
Yeah, or Pimp My Ride. Both shows where the whole basis was kind of, for better or for worse, like showing off your house or your vehicle and making it like the coolest looking thing ever. And there was like the only way to get onto that show, quite frankly, is if there was some level of probably multi-million-dollar investment in your pad so that people would be interested in seeing it and just being in awe of how cool and how much stuff there is in that house, right? Like what they can afford. Yeah. I remember one where they had Shaq's bed, and Shaq's bed is like the size of my living room. It's just the biggest bed I've ever seen, ever. Yeah. And I'm like, wow, I bet that bed is really expensive. Like, I have no doubt in my mind.
Well, HGTV, I think, even serves a similar function today. Like, we love to see the house that's flipped, and we see how beautiful it is, how money took something that was ugly and broken and made it beautiful and desirable. Oh, and I think we're tempted to believe money can do that to anything, I think, even if it's myself.
That's good. No, I think that makes sense. It reminds me of the quote from this book I have been reading on Ecclesiastes, and I've just been thinking about it a lot. But because of the fall, the reality is with everything that we're going to talk about in the Ecclesiastes series, humans are bound. We're bound. We're like almost instinctively hardwired by it, by sin, to continue to try to find meaning in things that can't do it, that are inappropriate and impossible. It will give you like a quick high when you like succeed, and then will very quickly fade away because it does not last, right? You trying to find your meaning and purpose and value in work will always leave you wanting. And trying to find your meaning and purpose and value in wealth and possessions will do the exact same thing every single time. It's not only impossible, it's inappropriate, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
good.
like I thought the same thing as you, like power and status. Also for me, I can say, which I think it comes along a similar line, when you have enough power, you are emotionally, you feel like you are actually secure, right? Like there is an aspect of provision. We kind of shore up our ability to deal with hard situations by forming a perimeter of wealth or possessions that will hopefully never force us to question our security or our purpose or our meaning or our value. Um, and so for me, it seems clear, even with what you and I are talking about, very few people as a whole actually have an addiction or a desire to like literal money, right? Like there's nothing very special about the green pieces of paper that we're given or like the number that's on your checking account. It's what you associate with that, with those pieces of paper or with that number, right? It's not the actual objects, but for you, it's whatever they represent. Like I'm going for a higher number to get more influence, or a higher number to have a higher status, or a higher number to have a better house, to feel more secure, or a higher number to pay off those student loans so that I won't be as scared, right? Like, or
Man.
to get some sort of freedom. That's just the reality of it. Like there's like a movie picture. I don't remember if it's the movie Scarface, but there is a movie where like the main actor is like literally bathing in money, right? Like he's in a tub filled with it. And actually, I think that that's not, it's not the money, it's what that represents to him. Somehow that makes him feel like the most powerful man in the world. Um, and the fact of the matter is, the reason we do this is because, again, as Ecclesiastes says, and we haven't really mentioned this as much, but we have eternity in our hearts. And so our hearts are always looking for something that's going to answer the question of what is eternal. And there's only a few things that are eternal, but the main thing that we can merely point to is God. Like, not to be campy, but like God is the answer to the eternity in our hearts. But in its place, until we get to that point, we are willing and able to fill it with so many other things that are just going to continue to leave us dissatisfied in the end. Stephen, can you relate to that? Do you feel like that makes sense as a human being? Like, is that what
Yeah,
happens to us?
I mean, in the two places, I mean, out of those ways, I think the two that I relate to most heavily right now is I always like the student loans thing. I think I'm always tempted to believe like if I had a little bit more money, I could pay off my loans and then I'd be at peace.
Yeah.
And it's easy to believe that lie that I'd be at peace after my loans, because after that, I'm sure it'd be, I don't know, it'd probably be a house or who knows what.
Yeah.
There'd always be the next thing in line that would be giving me anxiety, and I'd be thinking, if I only had a little bit more money,
Yeah.
I could do this, then
Yeah.
I'd be. I think that's where I see it the most right now.
I totally feel similarly. Like you will never run out of things to occupy your attention or your emotions financially. That's why they're even, I mean this in the nicest way possible, but even Dave Ramsey's method of paying off all of your debt, he does not say pay off all your debt and then be generous, but there are some implications to that where the reality is actually the more wealth you're able to attain, the less generous, the harder it is to be generous if you've not already started being generous or started giving of yourself, because our appetites are just insatiable. Um, we'll always find another thing. We just will. Our hearts are wayward that way. So I think just just to hurry up with like the teaching aspect, we're going to spend a lot of time dissecting some of this on Sunday. So I won't spend too much time really diving deep into this. But here are 4 themes from my perspective that Ecclesiastes teaches about money that I think is wisdom for us as human beings made in the image of God. The first one is, and we talked about this last week as well, but our appetite for wealth will never be satisfied. Just never will. Ecclesiastes 4:7-8 says, there was a man all alone. He had neither son nor brother, but there was still no end to his toil. His eyes were not content with his wealth. And one day he's sitting and he says, for whom am I even toiling? And why am I depriving myself of enjoyment? This too is meaningless, a miserable business, right? This is not the first time that wealth is mentioned in Ecclesiastes, but is the first clear definition of the reality of our absolutely insatiable appetite for wealth as a means of finding our value and meaning, right? This guy has no family to feed. He has no one to provide for. And so he asked the question, like, what am I even working for? Like, I'm on autopilot, just thinking that this is what I'm supposed to do. And I don't understand why I'm working so hard when I finally get down to it. What is wrong with me? And instead of like, and I think the question really is not why is he working so hard or what is he working for? I think it's what is he looking for? What kind of experience is he expecting to have, and what is he trying to gain by working so hard when he really doesn't have to? He's depriving himself of enjoyment. And again, it's not the literal green pieces of paper, but he has convinced himself of the narrative that this is the way to become powerful or successful or whatever he feels like is deficient in his life. And this is where he's at. And he finally has this moment of realization where, like, I'm working so hard and it doesn't actually have a point. You have a comment, Steven? Sorry.
Yeah, it reminds me in the Bible Project too, another way this compares to smoke is if you're standing in the midst of smoke, it can be blinding. And I see that's what this is talking about. I think he's blinded by his pursuit of wealth.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear too, and this is good to say early on, Ecclesiastes does point this out very subtly, but it is not, the reality is that great wealth and great poverty can be spiritually very similar situations, right? Even as we were saying, like, having more or less money is not going to solve the issues of your heart. It just won't. Even in the Christian tradition, there's like a long history of poverty and like vows of poverty. And there's even strong political narratives about how you got into poverty and like how you're supposed to treat people who are poor. But the fact of the matter is, the issue is always the heart. Even if you were in poverty, your mindset is still, and your attention is probably still going to be focused on, why do I lack? How do I get more? How do I get out of this situation? In the Bible, the poor are always people who could not meet their daily needs without help from others because of some system or situation they could not overcome. The poor are almost never pointed to as like people who choose to be there. It's almost always because of a disability or because of debt or because of unjust laws that they are there. It's just a difficulty that is real. And that's why for Israel, there was this thing called the Year of Jubilee. It was an erasing of debts. It was so important because Israel, just like the church, was called to be a nation without slaves or poverty. You're supposed to release people from their debt because there's a systematic injustice that comes with cycles of debt that are impossible to overcome. But here's the thing, talk about an appetite. Israel, in its whole history of thousands of years, literally never once celebrated the Year of Jubilee. It's supposed to be like every 70 years, I think, something like that. But it was supposed to be fairly often, and never once did they celebrate it because our appetites are too strong. It's too easy and too meaningful to us because of the narratives we believe to hold on to our wealth and not give it away, not release people from their debts, not loan without interest. It's just hard. And so regardless of the answer to great wealth is not to then be super poor, and the answer to being super poor is not to try to amass great wealth. Both of them come with heart issues that if you don't deal with, you'll just be in the same situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally.
So our appetites are never going to, for wealth, are never going to be satisfied uh, if our focus is on the wealth itself or the accumulation of wealth. The second thing that Ecclesiastes makes clear is that great wealth and possessions have the capacity to harm us greatly. Um, Ecclesiastes 5:12, the sleep of a laborer is sweet, whether they eat little or much. But as for the rich, their abundance permits them no sleep. I love that. Ecclesiastes 5:13, then I have seen a grievous evil under the sun, wealth hoarded to the harm of its owners. All their days they eat in darkness with great frustration, affliction, and anger.
Ouch.
I know. That's it's tough. I don't like it. Uh, this is just a practical consideration that wealth, in its both in its generation and in its maintaining, usually require a great deal of energy and a great deal of attention. And it requires so much attention, even that in the modern day, there are wealthy people who hire other people to pay attention to it for them. That's like how much attention it takes. Someone's 40-hour-a-week job is to pay attention to another person's wealth. Like, talk about, that's crazy. That's just the reality of how wealth is accumulated. And the fact of the matter is, the things you pay attention to most become the things you care the most about. The principle of the soul. And your soul begins to be warped within you because the constant attention to wealth and creating wealth will damage it, and it produces fruit. And the fruit, according to Ecclesiastes, is not being able to sleep. You're filled with anxiety. The fruit is you eat in darkness, because even when you're around people, all you're thinking about is that last venture that failed or that last investment that didn't go the way you wanted. You're with great frustration because you keep trying to put forward plans and plans and plans to make more money, and they keep not working. So now you need to come up with more plans. And there's affliction and there's anger as your relationships begin to become corrupted. And this is the capacity of wealth when it becomes the center of what you pay attention to, because you have found your value and your worth in it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's totally true.
You're
That
lost.
verse, it sticks with me. 5:17. They eat in darkness, great frustration, affliction, anger. And I think, like you said, the soul warped. That's what it feels like.
Um, 3, this was the same that we talked about with work, but wealth will not last and can literally be all gone tomorrow, right? Like, one thing that we talked about with work is that there's an inherent danger to it where, like, actually that applies more to the next one. But so wealth will not last and could be gone tomorrow. Ecclesiastes 5:14, there's the reality where wealth can be lost to some misfortune so that they have children and there's nothing left for them to inherit. If there's nothing left for them to inherit, it's like the situation in Job. Like, they've lost everything. They don't even have a couch to like hand to their children. They are literally destitute. And because of their wealth, their children are frustrated because they probably didn't work to get anything either. And so, again, the overarching themes of Ecclesiastes, that time and chance happen to all of us. Sometimes there are disasters that strike. Everything you had, every plan you worked for, and all your stuff can literally be gone in an instant. Flood, fire, tornado, earthquake, some mishandling, whatever the disaster.
COVID-19.
Do what?
COVID-19.
COVID-19, it can all be gone, and you can be devastated if that is where you found your value and worth and attention, right? Stephen, you as a youngin', you lost your house to a fire, right?
Yeah.
Talk about, I mean, what is the experience of having like everything you own essentially be gone in an instant?
I mean, I had the luxury of the childlike innocence of not understanding the gravity of it.
Right.
But I mean, my family went from a place where we moved to a new area and we didn't have homeowners insurance yet, and we literally lost everything. And that created like a void of like where there was once security and foundation that was now void.
Yeah.
And thanks be to God that that the Holy Spirit, through the work of His church, really provided for us in that time. But I think that's even pointing out your example too, where ultimately we found hope in the Lord's work through His church, not in the possessions themselves. What I remember at that time was the people that cared for us, not the things they gave us as much.
And yeah, exactly. And it's weird to say, but if the position of your heart or your family's heart were all that matters is our house and our possessions, then actually a disaster could actually cause you to ask questions that are more intense, like not just why did this happen, but now who am I without
Yep.
those things?
Yep.
Again, if your identity is like wrapped up in that, a natural disaster should not cause you to ask the question like, who am I? And am I still the same person without these things? But I think a world that we live in that is focused on materialism can make you really be like, if I did not have money, like I don't know who I am. Or like if I don't have I have a bajillion books. My identity is wrapped up in them. If I did not have those books, who would I be? I think that's a question that I ask from time to time. Because books are special. Books are the exception to the rule. So we've got your appetite will never be satisfied. Point number 2, your wealth can actually cause harm to your soul. Number 3, wealth and possessions will not last and can literally be gone tomorrow. And then 4, wealth cannot follow you into the grave. Speaking of here today and gone tomorrow with a natural disaster, even if your wealth isn't gone tomorrow, like you certainly could be, right? Like your wealth could outlast you. And here's what Ecclesiastes 5:5 says about that. Everyone, every person, leveling the playing field, comes naked from their mother's womb, and as everyone comes, so they also depart. They take nothing from their toil that they can carry in their hands. This too is a grievous evil. As everyone comes, so they depart, and what do they gain in the end? It's a good question. Here's another example. Ecclesiastes 6:5. This one actually makes me uncomfortable. Though it never, Ecclesiastes 6 actually compares someone who spends their whole life focused on accumulating wealth and possessions, even in the midst of security, as a stillborn child, a child that never actually got to live outside of their mother's womb. And it says about the stillborn child, though it never saw the sun or knew anything, it actually now has more rest than does that man. More rest. And even if that man had lived 1,000 years twice over, so 2,000 years, but fails to enjoy his own lot in life, his prosperity, then that stillborn child is better off. That is very hard to hear, I think.
Yeah.
That makes me.
It basically means you've moved backwards in 2,000 years.
Yeah.
There's a neutral point of just not living and misappropriating your wealth will actually like move you backwards.
Yeah. That makes me very uncomfortable, to be honest. The lengths of our lives are not at all guaranteed. And those that spend putting their trust and their value and their identity in wealth will live less of a life than a stillborn infant that barely took breath. And that should make us all very uncomfortable, honestly. The solution, I just want to say, the solution to excess materialism, the narratives we're taught, or the focus on wealth for most people, again, is not some form of like super deprivation or asceticism. It is not to go in the opposite direction, give away everything. The Lord might lead you to do that. I don't know. I know people who that's happened to, but that is still an issue of the heart, even if you go all the way in the opposite direction. The author of Ecclesiastes here is literally just step by step taking away every avenue of justifying or finding value in this world through the means of money, through the means of possessions, through the means of wealth. Because even if you had absolutely nothing, you would still have not dealt with the issues in your heart of what you find value in, of what you find worth in. And so the big question that these pose to us, like the author of Ecclesiastes is trying to pose, not to read too much into it, but if your appetite for wealth will never be satisfied, remember point number one, how then will you choose to measure what is valuable? How will you find satisfaction? If accumulating and maintaining wealth can harm your health, how will you choose to measure what is valuable? Right? If wealth will not last and can all be gone tomorrow, how will you choose what is valuable to you? Right? If your wealth cannot follow you into the grave, into death, how will you choose to measure what is valuable? These are the questions that are being posed to us. Will you follow the narratives that are under the sun, that the only thing that matters about you, your identity, your function, your willingness to be alive, right? Like what you do is going to follow your work or money or whatever? Or are you going to choose the narratives that are above the sun? I think that is the question that Ecclesiastes poses to us about wealth and possessions. Do you have any thoughts on that, Stephen?
Honestly, no. I mean, it's no. I think you said it well.
Well, let's talk for just a minute. We're going to talk a lot more about this on Sunday. But Stephen, talking about above the sun narratives, if we're not called to try to find our wealth and worth and value in our wealth and possessions, and instead we need to be looking in a different direction, what do you think, from the preacher's perspective, is the cost for us of not being a disciple in this world that's trying to tell us to do that?
Yeah, I think. I mean, even going back to the points you made, like the issue of appetite. Like, isn't it C.S. Lewis who says there's like a hole in our heart? There's like a God-sized hole in our heart that only God can fill. Yeah. I think as long as we try to fill our appetites with money, we will continue to be hungry.
Yeah.
Jesus says, like, I'm the bread, I'm the life. Compares himself to like the what's the water metaphor? The
water of life.
Well, yeah, the water of life. It's when he's with the woman at the well. Mm-hmm. I don't know. The thing that the passage just brought to mind, there's a passage in Isaiah where it says, it's talking about the person who makes an idol for himself. Like they literally would make idols that they would worship. So God's basically kind of mocking us for making this idol, or he's like, you have a large slab of wood and you make a fire with half of it. And what do you do with what's left over? You make an idol that you put your trust in and worship. And kind of like in a similar way, like money is symbolized by paper. It's like, what do you do with like these sheets of paper? You write and take notes on half of it, and then you bow down to the rest of it. And he says you have forgotten your rock. Like, I am your rock. And then I think the cost is money is a tool, but God is an advocate for us. He is a personal being that, like Psalm 23 says, your goodness and mercy will follow me. Like he is actively like chasing us. He is for us. Money it's dead. It's just going to lay there. You can use it as a tool. And like a hammer, you can choose to like construct good things with it because money is not a bad thing. But like a tool, you can also really hurt yourself. Like a saw can cut off your arm. And I think the cost of discipleship, the cost of not being discipled in this area, the cost of not leaning into what God's intentions are for your money is I think you misuse the tool and you cut your soul in half in a sense with that tool.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. Yeah. So, yeah. You use the same God you worship, you also use to buy toilet paper, right? Like how sacred is it to you? Like it's right. Like it's,
that would be really the same thing you use to wipe yourself with, you bow down to because it's both paper.
No, I think that's so true. Like, I think Jesus said something similar in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. You know, in the Sermon on the Mount, he's invited all of these people into the kingdom who thought they weren't invited, the poor, the persecuted, like the sinner, like all of these people he's saying have an opportunity to enter into kingdom life. But then very counterintuitively, instead of being like, and I'm going to fight on your behalf and like beat up all the rich people and take all their wealth and give it to you, right? Like instead of doing that, very counterintuitively, he actually in Matthew 6 says that, well, the truth is I don't have to do that because my disciples will be people who always have more than enough, no matter how much they have, right? He's like, I don't know. I'll be honest, this is an area of faith for me. This is an area of real struggle for me. But he's really saying somehow, some way, the same God that intentionally provides the means and the environment for beautiful flowers to bloom and for birds to eat without storing up any food is going to provide for you. We do not ever have to worry about not having enough. Somehow, whatever enough ends up meaning, it means that your value is not determined by your numbers or possessions. Your status in heaven has nothing to do with your status on earth. Your worth does not change with the stock markets or with your housing situation or even when you win the lottery. People will treat you different, but God will not. You will be the exact same. And the same question will always be posed to you. Do you have enough? And disciples of Jesus get to say, yes, no matter how much I have, I always have more than enough. Yeah. All of those things, your status, your identity, your worth, they are set from the foundations of creation. You never, ever, ever have to worry about running out of those things, ever. Your security and your purpose and your value were defined long ago, and nothing can take those things away from you. As disciples of Jesus, we have the freedom to give freely of ourselves without fear of running out. And when we are finally in that place in our hearts, when we understand that God's kingdom is a kingdom of abundance, we can finally then, I think Stephen helped me understand this, we can finally then determine what is actually enough materially for wealth and possessions. Only from a place of security and understanding that nothing can make those things go away, even death, we can understand what is enough for us and we can be satisfied no matter how little or how much we have. And our hearts will change and we'll know that we really are valuable as treasures that will last forever, and that our relationships will change. We'll continue to be faithful to friends and family. We'll continue to be steadfast in our community. Our priorities will be shifted, and we'll be able to look at even a very simple situation or a simple house or whatever and be like, I really do have more than enough. There's nothing more than I need. And that is the narrative I think Jesus points to. That's way more complicated than I'm making it sound, but at the same time is very simple when you choose to trust in that reality, that there's nothing that can take those things away from you. That's just a truth that I'm continuing to discover day by day.
Amen.
And so that's kind of, I think, a pretty good summary of what Ecclesiastes and the preacher has to say about wealth and possessions. If you have questions, please feel free to ask. We're going to spend a lot of time discussing this on Sunday, I hope. I think it'll be really fun wrestling through this together, because I think there are going to be few things that are as counterintuitive in our culture today as having a biblical and Jesus-focused mindset on what our wealth and provision can be used for the kingdom for. I think that is just one of the most important things we can begin to work on together. So I'm really pumped about that. Stephen, any final thoughts?
No, I like that idea to end on. Like when we just did our evangelism series, consider what the world would do if all Jesus's disciples truly had his perspective on money.
Yeah.
That would be a shock.
Yeah.
I would be shocked.
I know.
A bunch of people doing that.
Well, guys, it was a pleasure serving you today. Excited to see you on Sunday. Again, please feel free to reach out, talk to us, let us know what you're thinking. We'll see you Sunday.